bill. So I join in the effort to present this legislation to the floor and allow us to debate it and to pass it. And with that, I yield to the senator from Connecticut.
I think, if I may be recognized.
The senator from Connecticut.
The senator from Vermont for being here will be followed by others who have not yet come to the floor. I expect them momentarily, but I want to thank my colleague from Vermont for being here today and for his very powerful remarks. And despite the objection, we are committed to pursue this issue, to seek a change in the law that will assure Americans that our military are used properly for the purpose that the founders and all of us want them to do. And I am pleased to be followed now by my colleague from California, Senator Schiff.
President.
Senator from California.
I thank Senator Blumenthal for leading this special order opportunity on the Senate floor on such a vital issue at such an important time. I stand in this well in support of my colleague's request as the senator representing both the state first impacted by the president's abuse of our military and one against which he has threatened further military action and deployment. So here we are. The president deploys thousands of members of the California National Guard on the streets of Los Angeles against the wishes of the mayor and governor. Here we are, the president tells the Marines, those who have trained to land on beachheads and be the tip of the spear, that their next mission will be Los Angeles. These might sound like hypothetical scenarios or the futuristic plot of some film, but this is what actually happened. And the president did not stop there. From Los Angeles, he turned to our nation's capital. He put the National Guard on corner after corner, even called on them to pick up trash. Because this has never been about crime or quelling some kind of rebellion or insurrection. For the president, who refused to act when our capital was under actual insurrection on January 6th, this has never been about public safety. It has been about control. It has been about quashing dissent. It has been about using our troops as political pawns to show anyone in any city in America that the president is not to be crossed. But such deployments of our service members are dangerous, they are destructive, and they are illegal. We are grateful to our National Guard to lend a hand in times of natural disasters like fires and floods, and we have all too much experience in both in California. But it is plainly not permitted under the law to use the armed forces to assist the president in some ambiguous campaign of fear or domestic policing or indiscriminate immigration raids. That is not the purpose of the military. That is not the function of the military. That is not a lawful use of the military. And courts around the country have recognized the lawless nature of these deployments and the false representations made to justify them, or try to, as one judge in Portland observed, the administration claims are untethered to facts. And because the legal justification for these deployments has been found legally wanting, the president and his administration, including the chief architect of this campaign of suppression, Stephen Miller, have dusted off and may be prepared to deploy a different archaic law to form an even more dangerous and expansive legal basis for these deployments, and that is the Insurrection Act. The Insurrection Act was originally enacted in 1792 during a very different era when our republic was in its infancy. It was intended to provide the president, in only the rarest and most extreme circumstances, with the ability to federalize our military to respond to and suppress a rebellion or insurrection against the authority of the United States. It was not enacted to empower the president to deploy the military to pick up trash or to engage in domestic policing or do things that local police or law enforcement could do on their own. No, it was enacted to suppress a rebellion against the government or an insurrection against the government. The law was, in fact, intended by Congress as an exception to another law, the Posse Comitatus law, that otherwise forbids the military from undertaking domestic law enforcement. The Insurrection Act, therefore, must be understood as an authority that Congress enacted at the outset of our republic for a president to use only in the narrowest and most exceptional and extreme of circumstances, where all other means of protecting our country and enforcing our laws have been exhausted. That is clearly not the case here. The history and purpose of this law is clear and should not be abused by any president. It should only apply to cases of demonstrable insurrection or rebellion against the United States and where all other means of protecting Americans and enforcing our laws simply do not exist. Now, let's look at the plain facts of the matter. There is no rebellion or insurrection, not in Los Angeles, not in Portland, not in Chicago, not in San Francisco, not in Washington, D.C., nowhere to be found. So what's really going on here? Well, I think the president admitted it very plainly when he spoke to generals and admirals last month at the Pentagon, when he spoke of an invasion from within. And he spoke of his real goal, which was, quote, "We should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military." But our cities are not military training grounds. And there's no way to assert an insurrection like the Shays Rebellion or the Whiskey Rebellion that had occurred shortly before the Insurrection Act was passed in the 1790s to justify today the unjustifiable. There is no disorder in this country that cannot be dispersed by state and local law enforcement. But despite the clear letter of the law not being met here, the president continues to flirt with invoking the Insurrection Act anyway. Because the president's goal here is not to prevent disorder, but to create it. Not to quell unrest, but to provoke it. To enlist the nation's military in a civil dispute against his perceived enemies, against community organizers, against American cities, against clergymen, against those who fight to uphold the checks and balances in our Constitution, against a free and fair press, against journalists, against our courts, against anyone who dares to raise their voice against him. It is no accident that this president and administration have deliberately tried to paint all of his opposition, political opposition, everyday citizens out protesting on No King's Day. He would paint them all who stand up for our Constitution and our rights as Americans, he would paint them all as some kind of terrorists or extremists. That is the language we hear from the White House, and that is the language we hear from authoritarians who use it to justify using the awesome power of the state, including its military, against its real or perceived domestic opponents. And we should not take this president's threats idly. We should make clear, as Senator Blumenthal would do with his legislation, that the president's flirtations with this law are not within his powers, that the military is not his to deploy for pageantry, political theater, vengeance, or intimidation. In the president's words, he calls this law unquestioned power. And that is really what the president is after, unquestioned power. Does that sound like a president who believes in a system of checks and balances? Does that sound like a president who believes in democracy? Or does that sound like a president who wants to be a king and will use any law, archaic or otherwise, as a pretext? because the use of this law could forever erase the line between an apolitical military and the political whims of the Oval Office. Now, Donald Trump has repeatedly sought to pit state against state and deploy the Guard from now one state against another state. And this not only tears at the social cohesion of our nation, but also so undermines our military, which has the broad trust of our people and squanders that trust. When you consider the sacrifices that are made by men and women in uniform, to squander that sacrifice by deploying the military against our own citizens, to take them away from the focus of their job, the mission of their job, which is to protect our country from foreign enemies and adversaries. It is not only dangerous to our people, but also disastrous to the military. And I say to my colleagues here, even if your city is not Chicago like Senator Durbin's, or your state is not Connecticut as Senator Blumenthal, or your state is not California or Oregon, and may not be on the tip of the president's tongue now, there is nothing that will protect you when he turns against your state next. Not if you don't stand up now. This slippery slope only gets steeper. The voice of dissent must get louder. We must stand now before the troops are quartered in every city, pulling your community's families out, hog-tying the children in your cities in front of their parents, before Black Hawk helicopters are landing on your roofs, before your citizens are being asked for their papers and paying fines just to go about their lives. Now is the time to speak louder. Now is the time to insist on adherence to the law. Now is the time to push back against even greater abuses of the law, like we would see with the invocation of the Insurrection Act. I thank my colleague for leading this debate, and I yield back.
Mr. President.
Democrat Whip.
Mr. President, let me first thank Senator Blumenthal for bringing us together on the floor this afternoon, and also Senator Schiff for his excellent statement on this issue, which is so timely and important. I speak to this issue in unusual personal position. My state, my home state of Illinois, the state that I am elected to represent in the Senate, a state that I love, is under siege by this administration. If you think I'm exaggerating, imagine, if you will, for a moment, a president who's decided to declare that your town, your state, is somehow on his list to face punitive action by the delegation of military force. That's what's happening in Illinois. That's what's happening in Chicago. This last Saturday, we had the No Kings rallies across the United States. Millions of Americans took the time to peacefully protest this administration's policies. In Chicago, I cannot tell you the number of people in the crowd because no one is sure. I'm sure it was over 100,000. My wife and I looked at that sea of people at the Petrillo Bandshell in Grant Park and thought, how many people could possibly be here? They were there and they marched peacefully, nonviolently, to really use their constitutional rights to express themselves. The president has designated Chicago as uninhabitable, unlivable, violent. It's just a fraud and a lie. It's not true. Does Chicago have its problems? You bet it does. So does a city in the state of California or Connecticut or even Utah. Each of our cities has its challenges, and there will always be someone who will break the law and disappoint you. But to argue that the city is dangerous and needs to be occupied by National Guard troops from Illinois and the state of Texas is completely, completely wrong. I recall that the president was right in one respect. 2 weeks ago, there were people running through the streets of Chicago. 53,000 of them, as a matter of fact, in the Chicago Marathon, and thousands of others who came there to witness it and cheer them on. It was a beautiful scene on a Sunday morning and afternoon in the city of Chicago. And it certainly didn't tell the story that President Trump and others are trying to tell about the city. Just last week, President Trump called the Insurrection Act, quote, the strongest power a president has. President Trump is known for exaggerating, but this time he wasn't. In his hands, the hands of a man who wants to be king, who nearly every day undermines checks and balances in the Constitution, the Insurrection Act as it stands today would serve as yet another tool for dangerous executive overreach. Since its enactment in the 1800s, presidents of both parties have relied on the Insurrection Act selectively. And as we've discovered over time, the law is dangerously outdated, vague, and vulnerable to abuse if wielded by a president who refuses to act in good faith. President Trump talks frequently about so-called, quote, enemy within in the United States. He has no qualms about spreading baseless lies about a rebellion or an emergency in American cities to justify his abuse of power. Whether it is unleashing federal agents to detain people based on the color of their skin in Chicago, or improperly deploying Marines for civil law enforcement in Los Angeles, you see example after example. The founders of this nation designed the Constitution to protect generations of Americans from abuses unfolding before our eyes today. To prevent presidents from using the military as a weapon of tyranny, the framers of the Constitution constrained the role of the military in civilian affairs, gave Congress control over when the military may be deployed, and barred the federal government from usurping state powers. And while the Insurrection Act gives the president greater authority to deploy the military within the United States, it was never meant to be used for the purpose President Trump is proposing. Congress must act to update this law to ensure it can only be used to safeguard the nation. And I want to commend Senator Blumenthal for taking steps with legislation that he's introduced along those lines. If you don't agree with me, listen to what Jack Goldsmith, Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel under President Bush, wrote in the New York Times with Bob Bauer just this last Monday. He wrote, and I quote, "The Insurrection Act was written for a different century and a different conception of the presidency and presidential self-restraint." Or listen to what experts at the libertarian think tank Cato have said. The sweeping language of the Insurrection Act makes it a potentially decisive and lethal tool in the hands of an authoritarian chief executive. Earlier this month, the Republican governor of Oklahoma criticized the deployment of Texas Guard troops to Illinois as a violation of, quote, states' rights. He went on to say further, to rightly call out the hypocrisy of his own Republican Party. Imagine the outrage, this governor of Oklahoma said, if, quote, Governor Pritzker in Illinois sent troops down to Oklahoma during the Biden administration. I can imagine it, and you can too. Republican senators who are quiet about the president's misuse of his office and the misuse of power would not be quiet if their own state and their own hometowns were at stake in this debate. The reform bill my colleague from Connecticut has introduced preserves presidential discretion to respond to genuine crisis while ensuring accountability and oversight and reducing the risk of abuse. Mr. President, I don't exaggerate when I tell you that having spent my life in government service, I am more worried now than I've ever been about the fate of this republic. When I see the possibility of the use of the Insurrection Act by this president, I worry that our democracy will struggle to survive. I believe so dearly in this country that I've taken an oath willingly and happily to uphold its Constitution. I've turned to military leaders under President Trump's first term that I respected, like General Milley, and asked him basic questions such as, given a choice, are you going to take your orders from the Commander-in-Chief or from the Constitution? He said, always the Constitution. We have a lot at stake now in this national debate. It's about a lot more than who gets the morning headline and who wins the next election. What is at stake is the future of our democracy, and this Insurrection Act can be misused by this president in ways that are unimaginable. We've seen evidence of it already in my state of Illinois and city of Chicago. I thank the senator from Connecticut for leading us in this conversation that must continue, and I yield the floor.